Welcome to another Deep Dives. Today we're going to be looking into something pretty interesting, the tailbone.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we've got, a pretty interesting mix of sources that you sent over to me, YouTube videos from Islamic channels, and then it looks like some transcribed excerpts and even some summaries of scientific research.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so we're going to be trying to figure out what we can learn about the tailbone, its significance in Islamic beliefs, and what modern science might have to say about it.
Yeah, it's really intriguing how this one little bone, it can bring together like faith and tradition and scientific discovery.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. So let's dive in. Maybe we can start with what Islam teaches about the tailbone. What have you found in those sources?
Well, they all seem to emphasize that in Islam, the tailbone or the coccyx is believed to be the only bone that doesn't decay after death. And it's seen as the seed for resurrection on Judgment Day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a belief that's deeply rooted in Islamic faith and tradition.
You mentioned that there's a saying from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that kind of captures this idea.
Yes. There is a hadith that states, every part of the son of Adam will be consumed by the earth, except the coccyx from which he was created and from which he will be reconstituted.
Wow. So that really highlights how central the tailbone is to this belief in resurrection.
Yeah. And to the idea of creation, too.
Yeah. So you have this ancient belief about the tailbone being indestructible. But what about from a scientific perspective? What makes the coccyx so unique?
Well, scientifically, the coccyx is fascinating because it forms from the primitive streak, during the very early stages of embryonic development. And this primitive streak is essentially the blueprint for our body's axis, how everything is laid out.
Right.
And while the streak itself disappears, it leaves behind a trace. And that's the coccyx.
So you could say that the coccyx is kind of a marker of the origin of human development.
Exactly. And that seems to kind of echo the Islamic belief about it being the starting point for creation.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And some of the sources mention that the coccyx might be more resistant to decay than other bones. Is there any scientific evidence to support that claim?
There have been some studies suggesting that the coccyx's dense bone structure might contribute to its resilience.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that decomposition is a really complex process. It's affected by so many things, like the pH of the soil, the temperature.
Right.
So while the coccyx might be tougher than some bones, claiming that it's absolutely indestructible doesn't really align with our current scientific understanding.
Right. It's more about degrees of resilience than absolute indestructibility.
Exactly.
But even that level of resilience is pretty interesting, especially, when you consider how long this belief has been around. So were there any scientific discoveries that might kind of shed more light on this idea of the coccyx's resilience?
Actually, there were some pretty fascinating experiments done in the early 20th century by a German scientist named Hans Spieten.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was doing groundbreaking work on embryonic development back in the 1920s and 30s, and he actually ended up winning the Nobel Prize for his research.
Wow. So what kind of experiments was he doing?
Well, he was really interested in the primitive streak
Oh.
and its role in development.
Okay.
And in one experiment, he transplanted the primitive streak from one embryo to another, and incredibly, it formed a completely new organism.
Wow. So he basically confirmed that the primitive streak really is like a blueprint for life.
Yeah, exactly. But then he took the experiment even further. He boiled and froze the primitive streak.
You what?
Yeah. He figured that would destroy its ability to generate life.
Right.
But amazingly, even after this harsh treatment, the primitive streak still managed to create a new organism when it was transplanted.
Wow. He boiled it and froze it, and it still worked.
It did. And, this brings up a really fascinating point. Speckman's work was purely scientific, but his findings maybe unknowingly echo that centuries-old Islamic belief about the resilience of the coccyx, which is derived from the primitive streak.
Right. It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really does.
So we're starting to see how this seemingly, simple bone, this tailbone, has generated all this discussion across both faith and science.
It really highlights the power of observation and how different disciplines can approach the same concept from very different angles.
It seems like there's a real connection between these ancient Islamic beliefs about the tailbone and these modern scientific discoveries. Are there any more recent studies that have explored this connection further?
There are a few. In 2003, some scientists in Yemen decided to test the resilience of the tailbone in a pretty dramatic way. They burned sheep tailbones to ash.
And what did they find?
Well, they found that while the surrounding tissues were completely destroyed, The bone structure itself remains surprisingly intact. It wasn't entirely indestructible, but it definitely showed a level of resilience that caught their attention.
So it wasn't like a perfect match for the idea of absolute indestructibility. But the experiment still points to something unique about the cassis's structure.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there anything else that kind of hints at the tailbone having these unique properties?
There is, and this might sound a little strange. Have you ever heard of teratoma tumors?
I can't say that I have. What are they?
They're tumors that are often found in the tailbone, and they can contain this strange mix of different tissues like hair, teeth, bone, even organ-like structures. It's like the tailbone has this hidden potential to generate all these different cell types.
Wait, so you're saying a tumor in the tailbone can grow hair and teeth?
It can. It's pretty
Really?
bizarre, but fascinating at the same time.
Yeah. Does this suggest that the tailbone somehow contains like a blueprint for building an entire human being? Like a seed?
It's a question that's been pondered by both scientists and theologians. The idea of the tailbone as the origin point for a human being aligns with both the scientific understanding of embryonic development and the Islamic belief in the cassis's significance.
Wow, we've gone from, ancient religious texts to modern day scientific experiments, and it's all connected by this one little bone.
It is. It's really fascinating.
It seems like we're seeing this intriguing interplay between faith and science, where they converge in these really unexpected ways. But I imagine it's not always a perfect fit, right?
You're right. There are definitely varying perspectives on how to reconcile religious beliefs with scientific discoveries.
Right.
Some people might see these scientific findings as supporting the Islamic claims, while others might be more hesitant to draw such a direct link.
So while these findings are definitely fascinating, it's important to remember that the belief in resurrection in Islam is primarily a matter of faith.
Exactly. It doesn't necessarily require scientific validation.
So with these different ways of knowing in mind, where do we go from here? What should we be taking away from all this information about the tailbone, its scientific properties, and its spiritual significance?
Well, first, I think it's important to recognize the immense significance the tailbone holds in Islamic belief. It's not just a bone. It's seen as the seed of resurrection, a testament to God's power to create. And second, science has uncovered some really remarkable things about the tailbone, especially its connection to the primitive streak and its potential role in early human development. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we see how the exploration of the tailbone brings faith and science together. It prompts us to consider mysteries that extend beyond what we can currently observe and measure.
It's definitely made me think differently about this often overlooked part of our anatomy.
Me too.
But before we go any further, I think we need to address the elephant in the room.
What do you mean?
Well, we've talked a lot about the tailbone being the starting point for both human development and resurrection.
Yeah.
But what about the actual process of resurrection itself? What does that look like according to Islamic teachings?
That's a great question, and it's one that deserves a deeper exploration. Islamic texts offer these really vivid descriptions of the Day of Judgment and the events that unfold. It's described as a divine act initiated by God's command, and the tailbone is seen as the focal point for this recreation.
So just as the body develops from the primitive streak during embryonic development, the belief is that on Judgment Day, the body will be recreated from the tailbone. It's like a seed that holds the potential for a whole new life.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? It speaks to the idea of renewal and the power of God to create life, even from what might seem like nothingness.
It certainly is. But is there any scientific basis for this concept of a whole body being recreated from a single bone? Can science even begin to explain such a thing?
That's where faith and science diverge from a purely scientific standpoint. The concept of resurrection is currently beyond our understanding. We just don't have the tools or the knowledge to explain how such a thing could happen.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that the religious belief is invalid.
Not at all. For believers, the concept of resurrection rests on the power and will of God, which transcends the limitations of our current scientific knowledge.
So in essence, it requires a degree of acceptance that there are things beyond our current comprehension. Things that may seem impossible from a scientific perspective, but are entirely possible within the realm of faith.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the limits of our own understanding and acknowledging the possibility of something greater than ourselves.
So what advice would you give to our listener who might be wrestling with these ideas, trying to reconcile their own beliefs with what science is telling us about the world?
I'd encourage them to approach this topic with an open mind and a sense of curiosity. Read the Islamic texts, explore the scientific research, and engage in thoughtful conversations with people who hold different perspectives. It's about seeking understanding, not necessarily definitive answers.
It's about embracing the mystery and recognizing that faith and science can coexist, even if they don't always align perfectly.
I think that's a great point. We don't have to choose one or the other. We can appreciate the insights offered by both faith and science and allow them to enrich our understanding of the world and ourselves.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the Islamic belief in the tailbone's significance for resurrection, and we've explored what science has to say about its unique properties. We've even touched upon the complex relationship between faith and science. But there's one last piece of the puzzle I'd like to bring up.
And what's that?
Well, this whole conversation has been about the tailbone as the starting point for new life, both in this world and in the hereafter. But it also makes me think about the end of life, about death. What does Islam teach about the soul's journey after death?
That's a profound question, and one that deserves its own deep dive. Islamic teachings describe a detailed and intricate journey for the soul after death, a journey that involves questioning by angels, a period of waiting in the grave, and ultimately judgment on the day of resurrection.
So even though the tailbone is seen as the seat of resurrection, the soul's journey begins long before the body is recreated.
Yes. The soul continues to exist and experience even while the body lies dormant. It's a fascinating concept that raises questions about consciousness, the nature of the soul, and the afterlife.
Wow, this just keeps getting deeper and deeper.
It does. There's so much more to explore and ponder.
This is definitely a conversation that could go on for hours.
Indeed, it's a testament to the richness and complexity of both Islamic thought and scientific inquiry.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time for this deep dive. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listener with a final thought.
What's that? It is a powerful image to think about that potential within us for renewal and resurrection.
It really is. You know, before we were talking about these teratoma tumors. They can grow hair and teeth and even organ-like structures. Right? Like they often show up in the tailbone.
They do, and they really make you think, could these tumors be evidence that the tailbone holds that deeper blueprint for a human being, like we see in Islamic thought?
So is that saying that modern science is validating what has been written in these texts for over 1,000 years?
Well, it's not quite that simple. You know, some people might interpret these findings as aligning with that Islamic belief. The idea that the tailbone is where a human being originates. It works with what science knows about embryonic development, and with the Islamic view of the Kasiviyaks as the starting point of creation.
But science and religion are coming at this from two totally different perspectives.
Right, absolutely. Science is always evolving, building upon what we know with new discoveries and new interpretations. What's accepted as fact today might be revised tomorrow. Religious beliefs, though, they're often rooted in faith and revelation. They offer a different way of understanding the world.
So then how do we reconcile these two perspectives? Are they always going to be in conflict, or can they coexist?
That's the beauty of exploring this topic. We're challenged to really think critically and to consider all the nuances of these complex ideas. You know, some people might find that scientific discoveries actually strengthen their faith. They might see these findings as confirming what they already believe from their religious texts.
While others might see science and religion as separate, but equally valid ways of understanding the world.
Exactly. There's no single right answer. The relationship between science and religion is a deeply personal one.
So let's bring it back to our listeners. What would you say are the main things we've learned from our discussion today?
Well, first, we've seen how this little bone, the tailbone, holds such huge significance in Islamic belief. It's not just a bone, it's the seed of resurrection. It symbolizes God's power to create life.
And from a scientific perspective, we've learned that the tailbone is much more interesting than we might have realized. Its connection to the privative streak, the blueprint for early human development. That's pretty amazing.
And lastly, I think this exploration into the tailbone shows how faith and science can come together. It makes us think critically and consider the mysteries of life that go beyond what we can see and measure.
It's been a wild ride so far. We've delved into ancient beliefs, explored modern experiments, even encountered those strange teratoma tumors, all because of this one tiny bone. But there's one thing I think we need to unpack a bit further. Well, we've talked a lot about the tailbone being the starting point for resurrection. But what about the process itself? Islamic texts have these vivid descriptions of the Day of Judgment. But how does the tailbone actually factor into the physical act of resurrection?
That's a really good question. According to Islamic teachings, the process of resurrection is a divine act. It's initiated by God's command. And the tailbone is believed to be the focal point, the seed from which the entire body is regrown.
So if I'm understanding correctly, just as we see a human being develop from the primitive streak during the embryonic stage, the belief is that on the day of judgment, the body will be recreated starting from the tailbone.
That's one way to put it. It's like the tailbone holds the blueprint, the potential for a whole new human form to emerge.
That's a powerful image.
Mm-hmm.
But is there any scientific basis for this concept of an entire body being recreated from a single bone? Can science even begin to comprehend such a thing?
That's where faith and science separate, at least for now. The idea of resurrection from a purely scientific standpoint is outside our current understanding. We simply don't have the scientific tools or the knowledge to explain how something like that could happen.
But that doesn't mean the belief is wrong, does it?
No, not at all. For those who believe, the idea of resurrection is about faith. It's the belief in a power that goes beyond the limitations of our current scientific understanding.
So we have to acknowledge that there are things we don't fully understand, things that might seem impossible to science, but are entirely possible within the realm of faith.
Precisely. And recognizing the limits of what we know, being open to the possibility of something greater than ourselves, that's a valuable perspective.
It makes you wonder what we might discover in the future.
Right.
What might seem impossible today could become clear tomorrow. But for our listeners who are thinking about all of this, how would you suggest they navigate this space where science and faith intersect?
I think the best approach is curiosity and an open mind. Don't be afraid to explore both Islamic texts and scientific research. Talk to people who hold different views. The journey is just as important as the destination.
It's more about understanding than reaching a final conclusion.
Exactly. Embracing the unknown and acknowledging that faith and science can coexist and even work together. That's where true learning takes place.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We've delved into the beliefs about the tailbone, examined its properties from a scientific angle, and even touched upon the complex relationship between faith and science.
Yeah.
But there's one more thing I'd like to talk about, something that's come up for me during this conversation.
What's that?
Well, we've been talking about the tailbone as the starting point, the seed of resurrection and new life. But this has also made me think about the other side of that coin, about death and what happens after. What does Islam teach about the soul's journey after death?
That's an important point. The Islamic teachings about the afterlife are really detailed. They describe a journey that begins right after death, where the soul is questioned by angels, then enters a period of waiting in the grave, and eventually faces judgment on the day of resurrection.
So even though the tailbone represents the potential for physical resurrection, the soul goes on its own separate journey right after death.
Yes. The soul continues to exist and have experiences, even while the body isn't active. It's a concept that has fascinated people for centuries. It raises big questions about consciousness, the nature of the soul, and what happens after we die.
We could spend hours talking just about that. It feels like we've only just started to explore this whole idea of the tailbone and its significance.
I agree. There's so much more to learn and to think about. It really shows how rich Islamic thought is and how science is constantly evolving.
Well, unfortunately, we're almost out of time for today's deep dive. But before we finish up, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought.
What's that?
We've been talking about this tailbone as, symbol of resurrection, renewal. But it also makes me think about our own lives, maybe in a more symbolic or metaphorical kind of way.
What do you mean?
Well, we all go through tough times, right? Moments that feel like the end of the world, like a kind of death, But just as the tailbone seems to disappear, only to reappear in this new form, maybe those experiences also hold the potential for, rebirth transformation.
I like that. It kind of speaks to that resilience of the human spirit.
Right.
Our ability to adapt and grow, even when things are really difficult.
Yeah, and it ties back into what we were talking about earlier, about the tailbone representing that point where what we know and what we don't know come together, like science and faith.
The tailbone, scientifically speaking, is part of the physical world. It's part of our anatomy. We can study it, understand it through science. But at the same time, it has this deep spiritual meaning connected to the idea of resurrection and the mysteries of the afterlife.
So it's like a bridge between those two worlds, the tangible and the intangible.
Exactly. It reminds us that there might be more to life than what we can see or explain with science right now. And it encourages us to be open to possibilities beyond what we currently understand.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? This one little bone at the bottom of our spines can hold so much meaning and lead to such fascinating conversations.
It is. It really shows us how everything is connected, how something so small can have such big implications.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you see the relationship between your own beliefs, whether they're religious or spiritual, and what science tells us about the world? Does science make you question your faith? Or does it strengthen it? Or maybe it gives you a whole new way of looking at things?
For me, it's an ongoing conversation, a journey of learning and discovering. And I think the most important thing is to stay curious, to keep asking questions and searching for understanding.
We've definitely given you a lot to think about today. We hope this deep dive has made you curious and encouraged you to keep exploring this topic.
Remember, learning never really ends. There's always something new to find, something new to think about. Who knows what other secrets the tailbone holds? Or the world around us.
That's right. So until next time, keep searching, keep questioning, and keep exploring.